So I hear a lot of people saying make America great again, or we should go back to the old days, or times were so much better in the 90s or the 80s. I don't know what era that y'all lived in, because I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. And those were not nice times. They were violent, very, very violent times in our country. I remember when the crack epidemic hit in the 80s. I was a kid, and it was like an open air drug market all through New York State. You could go to Albany, Schenectady, Brooklyn, Queens, Rochester, Syracuse, shit, even Poughkeepsie. And there were open air drug markets, like people selling crack with immunity, like the police wouldn't even stop them. The murders and shootings, I know 1 year in New York City alone, there was over 3,000 homicides. 3,000, bro. Imagine 3,000 bodies piled up in one place. That was just in New York City. You still had Albany, Schenectady, Troy, Buffalo, even Utica, and all these other places that were getting hit with drugs that were so violent. There was so much violence. Going to school, people crying about school. Oh, school is so bad. Yo, there were shootings at my school. Like, people were getting in shootouts outside the school. People were getting stabbed. My man got stabbed in front of the middle school. 7th grade got stabbed. I had 2 dudes who was in 8th grade with me, got murdered in a park for their jackets. They had bear jackets out. And 2 dudes that was in 8th grade with me got murdered for their jackets. Another dude caught a homicide with 2 other kids. We was in 9th grade at the time. 10th grade, shootouts at parties and people dying. Those were not good times. Racism was rampant. Racial discrimination in jobs and housing, that shit was rampant. There was no Me Too movement. Women were getting sexually harassed at their jobs. Women were getting sexually harassed everywhere. The only people who enjoyed the 80s and the 90s were rich white men. That's it. Rich straight white men, because the LGBT community was being massively discriminated against. Between that, the cocaine epidemic, the cocaine wars, crack cocaine, heroin still being around, gangs coming up. You got to understand that was the time when gangs really became established. New York, LA, Chicago, all these places, even local gangs. Like in New York, we had Transformers, Decepticons, OSB, like different street gangs. I know in Miami, they had like Zopound and all these other gangs. All across the country, it was gangs and shootings and violence and stabbings, and everywhere you went was some violence, and there was no internet. So you ain't hear about these things. You only heard the local news or what came on CNN. News was on once a day. News is on 100 times a day now. Well, it was on twice a day. It was on like 6 o'clock and like 10 o'clock, maybe early in the morning, but I was in school then. So yeah, news is on 24 hours a day now. The internet is just, you go type something in and you pull it up and you can see it. So it looks like, oh my God, things are so horrible. I'll give you an example. There were 3,000 murders in New York State. I mean, in New York City alone, just in like 1 year in the 90s, right? There were 500 murders in New York City this year. Well, last year. And that's considered a bad year. They were like, oh, crime is rampant. 500, bro. That's 2,500 less than was going on in the 90s. The 80s and the 90s were terrible times in America. It was racist. It was discriminatory. Redlining was rampant. Drug addiction was rampant. Violence was rampant. Schools were not safe. Yes, there was less suburban kids getting their schools shot up. Yeah, there wasn't a lot of school shootings going on in suburban areas. I mean, they were still happening, but yeah, there was less suburban people getting hurt. But in the ghettos, in the hoods, if you were impoverished like me, if you was eating cube steaks with butter noodles for dinner, yeah, it was going on. And my father worked a job. My mother was a drug addict, but my father worked hard to do what he could. He wasn't really home, so that left me to run around the streets. We were on 10 Brook first in Arbor Hill, which wasn't a good neighborhood because Swan Street was like all drugs and shit. We moved to Schenectady, which was decent. It wasn't a really bad neighborhood, but The bad neighborhoods were all around. I went to school with the bad neighborhoods. So everybody was around us. The bad neighborhoods was a couple blocks away. You was never far away, so you was always around that and maybe a block away, and that's where I was always at because my father was at work or my grandmother was the one watching me. So I was always around those neighborhoods and things. But it was horrible in America. So I don't understand what you want to make great again. I don't understand what you want to go back unless you're white, straight, and rich. You want to go back to discriminatory practices? You want to go back to doing cocaine in the club because you could afford it and nobody else could? This is when cocaine was really not affordable to people in the urban communities. This is one of the big reasons why people started smoking crack in the urban communities, because it was cheaper and it was easier for them to make and break down. The high was stronger as well, so it created addiction, etc. So you had a lot of people who was coming up and getting rich off the misery of others, while there were whole communities being destroyed as this was put into the communities, etc. So those times were not good times for anybody that was poor like us, or even lower middle class. See, a middle class actually existed then. But you had a lower and an upper middle class. You had people that was like, okay, our bills are paid, our water's on, our electric is paid, we might even got cable. And some people, they're in a house with no cable. They're poverty. So yeah, you say, oh, well, these people are middle class. But the reality is we're check to check and we're buying certain foods. And I used to get in trouble if I eat some shit I'm not supposed to eat because we don't have food to make it throughout the week. That shit is all accounted for. And then you have the people who they had a house and they had a car. I remember the only reason we had a car was because my uncle gave my father a car. Before that, my father was taking a bus to work. He would have to leave for work like an hour and a half early, take the bus, and then come back. It would take him an hour and a half to get back home. So he goes to work for 8 hours plus 3 hours. That's 11 hours, has to come home and cook. Because at the time I was a kid, I couldn't cook, my sister too, and have to cook for us and get shit together. Luckily, my grandmother was around and sometimes she did the cooking or clean the house and things like that. So we had that. But those times, yeah, there was great music. There was great retro nostalgia. Those Reebok pumps, that was dope sneakers, or the Jordans, that was dope. The Jordan ones, people got murdered for those. Bear jackets, all that stuff. People got murdered for those. Heavily. A lot. People got killed for starter jackets. People were dying behind those type of things. You wasn't wearing a gold chain unless you was a gangster, because somebody is coming for that. Robbery was rampant. Murders was rampant. People had no problem with robbing you and shooting you as they robbed you. Nobody gave a fuck. The prison systems were insanity. When I went to the prison system in 1999, 1998 I went to the county, but when I went to the prison system in 1999, and this was towards the end of the era, it was ultra violence. The whole time I was in there was just violence. It's safer now. There's cameras. The COs are actually making sure people are okay. They didn't give a fuck back then. I seen a blood dude come into the compound knowing that they couldn't live in green when I was in green. He tells CO, he says, I'm blood. The CO said, I don't know what the fuck to tell you, pop off. This is the CO that's supposed to be there to protect people. Tells an inmate, go pop off, knowing he gonna get smashed on. They didn't give a fuck. That's how that era was. The police didn't care about you. You couldn't even file on the police. There was no internet. You gotta go into the precinct and write a form out to file on a cop in front of the cops. They gonna throw your shit out and tell you to get the fuck out. They might arrest you. They might beat you up and arrest you for even coming in there and trying to file that. You couldn't file against the police. They was doing whatever the fuck they want, especially in Schenectady. In Schenectady, they was out there robbing people. Look up Schenectady Police Department in the 90s. Dirty police department. Moving kilos with drug dealers, robbing drug dealers. One cop shot himself in the head in the precinct because he couldn't even take it when he was under investigation. He knew he was going to prison. This is the environment that the 80s and the 90s was. I don't ever want to go back to that. Racism, violence, drugs, warfare, shootings, fuck that. Keep that shit in the past. America is way better now. Do things need to change? Yeah, we need things to change. There's not equality like there should be. There's police officers that are racist. There's still a lot of issues within communities. But at the end of the day, shit way better than the 80s and the 90s. And if you think otherwise, you're white and rich.